If you've watched this channel a good amount in the past, you know that I love NBA trades. I love the trade machine. I love figuring out value for different teams. And today, I wanted to establish who the most valuable player is on every single team. Not draft picks, not any of that. The number one most valuable asset in terms of a player on every single NBA team in a trade. Really quickly though, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Delete Me. Everybody knows that personal information being shared online is a big problem right now, and because I live a good part of my life online, these data brokers getting and selling my personal information is a huge concern for me, so I use Delete Me to help. I want to try and stay as private as possible and keep my information safe, and that is exactly what Delete Me is for. Just look at this report of all the sites Delete Me found and got rid of my personal information, and this was just from one report. Having this kind of service that not only finds my information but also protects and deletes it is extremely helpful and gives me some peace of mind. And if this is a concern for you as well, I'd encourage you to check out Delete Me. If you sign up, you can get 20% off when you use code SPORTING20 or click the link in the description. Again, that is code SPORTING20 or click the link in the description for 20% off. Thank you to Delete Me for keeping my information safe and for sponsoring today's video. And we begin with the San Antonio Spurs. This is a really easy one. Of course, it's going to be Victor Wembanyama. There's no other answer here. It would have been interesting what this question would have been a year ago, whether it be Keldon Johnson, maybe Devin Vassell. There was a lot of different answers to that question, I would argue, last year. But now with Wemby there, I can't even imagine. I think Oklahoma City would probably trade every single draft pick they have if they could just transport Wemby onto their team. Obviously, it's going to be Victor Wembanyama for San Antonio. For Detroit, I went with Cade, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some people watching this video that think that maybe it's Asar Thompson, maybe it's somebody else just because of Cade's injury issues last year. I'm still a believer in Cade. I think we're going to see a lot of good stuff from him in terms of elevating his teammates this year. I don't think it's particularly close compared to anybody else on the roster, whether it be Ivy or a Thompson twin, but if you do, that's fine. Next up for Houston. This is going to be probably one of the more controversial ones. A lot of people are going to have a different opinion on this one, whether it be Jalen Green. Şengün probably is going to get some votes. I'm going to put Jabari Smith here. We had some really good signs from him at the end of last year in terms of offensive creation, really good summer league, really good preseason. And I'm just going to argue that in a trade, there are less players available for trade around the league that look like Jabari Smith than there are that look like Jalen Green. And I think those are the two guys, as cool as Şengün is and as interesting as he is, I think those are the two guys competing for the number one spot here. And Jabari Smith is just a more unique player with his size and skill level than Jalen Green, who's good, but he's a scoring guard. And those aren't all that difficult to find, even as young as he is. And then, Jabari has the extra year of youth on him as well, extra year of a younger contract. So I'm going to go with Jabari for Houston, but I'm expecting that one to create some debate. Next up now for Charlotte. This one was actually pretty difficult too, because I thought about going Brandon Miller because he has the new rookie contract, but I'm actually going to go with LaMelo. I know he's on a massive deal. I know he's not on the rookie deal compared to Brandon Miller, and that can change some things for you. I just think LaMelo is really, really good. I'm not sold on Brandon Miller. I think it's pretty uncertain what he's going to be, and I know what LaMelo is, and I think in a trade there'd be a lot more interest and value in exchange for LaMelo than there would be for Brandon Miller, which ultimately is what we're talking about here. Next up for Portland, I'm going to go Scoot. I don't think it's close. Like there's some, Shaedon Sharpe, there's maybe you can get Jeremy Grant for some stuff, but I think right now Portland offered Scoot to other teams. There's a lot of teams that were hoping that they could get in the top three of that class and get him. I think he's certainly the most valuable player asset on their team. Next up now, Orlando. I really wanted to put Franz here, but I'm going to go with Paolo. I think the tiebreaker for me was the extra year of the rookie contract. Franz is really, really good, and Paolo obviously was quite good as a rookie. I like them both equally as players. I think they're equally as good, and it literally just came down to the fact that Paolo has an extra year left on his rookie deal. I think that makes him a slightly better trade asset, but this is basically a tie for me. I love both of these guys. Next up now, Utah. This one was pretty easy. I went with Lauri Markkanen. They have some interesting young players on their roster, but none of them nearly as proven as Markkanen. Again, the argument here in terms of a contract could be that maybe Walker Kessler, because of how cheap his contract is compared to Lauri, who's not on a crazy deal, but it's still, a bigger number. Maybe you could argue that Kessler is worth more, but I think if Utah offered Lauri Markkanen to teams, I think they'd get a couple of firsts for him. I think he's that good. Borderline All-NBA caliber season last year. Still very young, could shoot, good size. I'm going to go with Lauri here for Utah, but I don't have an issue if you want to try and argue for someone else. Washington was hard to find some good trade assets here. You could maybe go with Coulibaly. I mean, he's looked good in preseason, but I think he's still pretty raw as a prospect. I'm going to put Kuzma here. It's not Jordan Poole because of the contract. None of the other young guys other than Cooley are really all that interesting, so I'm going to go with Kuzma. They could get a first for him if they tried to trade him right now, even on the deal that he just signed. Kind of slim pickings there in Washington in terms of who the top trade asset is, but I'm going to go with Kuzma. Moving on now to Dallas. This one's very easy. It's Luka. He's on a big contract, but there's nobody else that even comes remotely close. Kyrie obviously is a wild card. The rookies are interesting, but none of them value-wise, you guys know this, none of them value-wise are going to come close to Luka. Indiana, same thing. I'm going to go with Tyrese Haliburton. I don't think it's particularly close. You could make the argument for Mathurin because of the rookie contract stuff, because he was so good as a rookie. I don't think there's anybody else you could argue, for that top spot. I don't think it's Miles Turner or anything. But Tyrese Haliburton is an all-NBA caliber player, and Indiana was legitimately good when he played last year when he was healthy. And as interesting as Mathurin is as a scorer, I would rather have Haliburton, and I'm not fazed by the contract because I think Tyrese Haliburton's a max caliber player, and that's the deal that he's on. I don't think I don't think the difference in the contract is enough to put Mathurin ahead of Haliburton on this list. Next up is OKC, and I actually had more issue with this than I thought that I would because they've got so much young talent. I went with SGA, who's obviously very good, all NBA caliber guy, one of the best guards in the West. Love SGA. I did for a second think about either Jalen Williams, J-Dub, or Chet Holmgren. I did think about it because of the rookie contract stuff, because of kind of what we talked about earlier between Jalen Green and Jabari in terms of the uniqueness of a player like Jalen Williams or Chet compared to SGA. But SGA is so much more proven than Jalen Green, and I certainly think that in a trade situation, SGA would be treated as like a superstar kind of guy in a trade, and as good and as young as Chet and Jalen Williams, J-Dub are. I think it's SGA, but it's a really interesting conversation if you kind of think about the contracts that each of these guys are on, but I'm going to go SGA for OKC. Next up, Chicago. This was honestly kind of like the Washington situation where I was trying to figure out who the best asset is here. I'm going to go with LaVine. I think it's either him or Patrick Williams, and LaVine kind of decreased in value here because of some of the injury stuff over the last couple of seasons. People were worried about his knee or whatever the case may be. LaVine's still very good. Yes, he's on a big contract. Yes, maybe you're concerned about, him potentially leaving if you do trade for him. I'm going to put him here. If it's not him, it's Patrick Williams, I guess. Maybe you could go Caruso. I don't know. It's pretty tough there in Chicago, but I'm going to go with LaVine here with this pick. Next up now, New Orleans. I went with Brandon Ingram, but in like 2 months, the answer could easily be Zion. I think Zion is just you're so uncertain about what you're getting from him, how healthy he's going to be, how available he's going to be. But like I said, in like 2 months, if he's awesome to begin the year, Zion is probably the answer to this question. And if you offered a team Ingram or Zion, whichever one they want to offer more for, in 2 months, it could easily be Zion. I think right now in this moment, they're both on big deals. They both had some injury issues and concerns, but Ingram has just been more available. It's not saying much, but he has. I think Ingram's worth more right now, but I actually do think it's pretty close. Next up now, Toronto. They've answered this question for us. It's Scotty Barnes. They took him off the table in Kevin Durant and Damian Lillard trade discussions. Probably rightfully so, certainly for Dame. Other contenders would be someone like OG Anunoby. Pascal Siakam certainly is up there, but I think they've kind of answered this question because they haven't been aggressive in terms of re-signing Siakam, and they've kept Scotty Barnes out of trade discussions for a ton of big-time players, and so I certainly think he's number one for them. Minnesota, Anthony Edwards, not close. Karl-Anthony Towns is not even on the same stratosphere in terms of value in a trade. It's definitely Anthony Edwards for Minnesota. Atlanta, you'd think, oh, of course it's Trae Young, right? Well, I thought about it for a long time, and I was like, well, DeJounte Murray's pretty good. He's also on a big contract, but like, could you make the argument that maybe he fits better with some other teams? We saw that he got traded for multiple firsts. Is that what Trae would get? I did land on Trae Young. I did put Trae Young here, but I thought about it for a while in terms of him compared to DeJounte Murray in a trade. But what Trae is as an individual offensive player is just so much better than what DeJounte Murray is as an individual offensive player. And so I did end up going with Trae for Atlanta, but it was actually kind of close. For the Lakers, I went with Anthony Davis. I don't think that one's close at all. Even as cool as it would be to trade for LeBron, Davis is still, one of the best defensive players in the league, if not the best defensive player in the league. Unbelievable two-way guy when he's healthy. It's either him or LeBron, and I pretty easily think that it would be LeBron. It would be Anthony Davis if you offered them each in a trade. Miami, I went with Bam. I was kind of surprised about this one because I was kind of in my brain the last couple of teams when I was going through this of like, oh, it's just their best player. It's their best player. And it's not Jimmy Butler here in terms of trade value. I think Bam is incredibly valuable to a lot of teams, fits in super well to a lot of teams. And Jimmy Butler's getting up there in age. I think if you offered teams, hey, you can have Jimmy Butler, you can have Bam at this stage in their respective careers, I think teams would offer more for Bam than they would for Jimmy Jimmy Butler, so I'm going to put him at number 1 for them. Warriors is Steph. There's no point in even talking about that. Of course, it's Steph. Brooklyn, I went with Mikal Bridges. There's some interesting players on the roster. Nick Claxton, Cam Johnson, Cam Thomas, maybe even some Ben Simmons. But Mikal Bridges is on one of the best contracts in the league. And so I certainly think that he would be the top spot here for Brooklyn. Next up for the Clippers, it's pretty hard to find who the guy is. I went with Paul George just because in terms of really, I guess it's him or Kawhi, because I think they could still be worth, a good amount via trade, but Paul George is just way more available. So I'm going to go with Paul George for the Clippers. The Knicks, I went with Jalen Brunson, but I really didn't know who to go with here. I mean, maybe you could say RJ. Julius Randle certainly deserves a mention here, but I just kind of defaulted to RJ Barrett's not quite good enough, even though he's young. And I think that Jalen Brunson's better than Julius Randle, and they're on similar contracts. So I went with Jalen Brunson, but that was kind of a weird one to figure out, because when you think about the value, like I talked about earlier, of like smaller guards, how desperate are teams really going to be to trade for someone like Jalen Brunson? I'm not sure, but I still think he's worth more than Randle in a deal. Next up for Phoenix, it's Devin Booker. They've obviously got a lot of stars to pick from. We saw what they traded in exchange for Kevin Durant, but because of the youth of Devin Booker, I think he's actually worth more than KD, so I put Booker there. Cleveland is Donovan Mitchell. The argument is between him or Garland or Mobley, but I think because of the contract situation with Mitchell, now I'm second guessing myself. I'm going to stick with Mitchell. I'm going to stick with what I said initially, but it's close. I mean, Mobley's on the rookie deal. Garland is signed long-term, and he's going to be worth the deal. Mitchell's contract situation is weird right now. I'm going to stick with Donovan Mitchell because he's better than those two guys, but I think it's actually really, really close. Next up, Sacramento, it's De'Aaron Fox. Again, that one's not particularly close. Philadelphia is Embiid. Not particularly close. Memphis, I still think is Ja, even with the kind of craziness for him off the floor. It's either him or Jaren Jackson Jr. And when I went through it, it was actually a lot closer than I maybe realized initially. Again, you go back to that guard versus forward kind of uniqueness of the player thing, but I still think Ja's worth more. So I'm going to go with Ja. Boston is certainly Jason Tatum. And then these last couple are easy, of course. Denver's Jokic and Milwaukee is Giannis. But this was a really interesting exercise for me to try and figure out who the number 1 player asset in terms of a trade for every single team is. I encourage you to go through and do this yourself. Let me know kind of where you landed, if maybe you disagreed with some of the guys that I mentioned here. But that's the number 1 player trade asset on every single NBA team.